Shall we start? So, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. So, welcome to Insight Thursday. And my name is Ong Chop Pyo. I'm with the Fragility and Engagement Division under the CCSD. I'm also joined by my colleague In Hyuk Kwon from the Digital Sectors Office, and we'll be moderating this session together. Today, we are looking at how the artificial intelligence is beginning to shape the development of in the fragile and conflict affected situation, FCAS, and small island developing states. These are the contexts where weak institution, limited data, and digital fragility makes both the risks and opportunity of AI especially significant. So this session will give us a grounded overview of where AI adoption stands and what a responsible, context-appropriate pathway might look like in this context. We are today joined by two distinguished speakers from the AI Asia Pacific Institute, and allow me to briefly introduce them to you. The first is Kelly Forbes. She is the president and executive director of the Institute. Under Kelly's leadership, AIAPI has collaborated with the international organization, regional policymakers, government officials, and industry leaders to shape the future of AI. In addition to her role at the AIAPI, Kelly advises a leading enterprise software company, Click, and also serves on the advisory committee for the Dubai International Financial Center, DIFC. The next speaker is Peter Brimble. Peter is an economic development strategist with over 35 years of experience across multilateral institutions, fragile states, and technology policy. Peter is also a former ADB staff member. He led country programming and private sector development work at ADB in Cambodia and Myanmar. And later, he directed inclusive economic programs in Myanmar through the UK funded Tanaf facility. At the AI Asia Pacific Institute, Peter serves as a board chair and vice president and focuses on ensuring that responsible AI adoption supports MSMEs, workforce transformation, and equitable digital growth in Southeast Asia and Pacific. So please join me in welcoming Kelly and Peter. Kelly and Peter, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's really a pleasure for the AI Asia Pacific Institute to have the opportunity to talk to Insight Thursdays today. Essentially, what we want to talk about, as Ong Chop Pyo mentioned, is the state of AI in fragile and conflict-affected context and small island developing states. We're not talking about AI hype or rapid deployment of AI. We're talking about how AI is really already showing up in these economies, what the risks are, what the opportunities are, and how we can move forward to take advantage of artificial intelligence. The work that we're going to present here builds largely on work done by the AI Asia Pacific Institute for a number of regional and international partners, including the ADB, including the AIIB, and including ASEAN, among others, and also including significant work on AI in the Pacific Islands, where we have carried out a pioneering examination of AI and the status of AI in these small island developing states. Recently, we've worked on AI and workforce transformation, AI and online safety, and generative AI in ASEAN. And all of these works will feed into the analysis of AI and FCAS and SIDS. In terms of the context, as Ong Chop Pyo mentioned, FCAS and SIDS face, in some sense, different fragilities. FCAS are typically characterized by weak institutions, often conflict, limited service delivery, humanitarian challenges, political instability, and high exposure to shocks. Small island developing states, on the other hand, tend to be smaller domestic markets and talent pools, geographic isolation, high connectivity costs, climate vulnerability, and often dependence on external infrastructure. However, both groups of countries share the same challenges for AI adoption, with limited institutional capacity, high levels of external dependency and high cost for errors if there are mistakes made in public policies. So we have a context where the two groups of countries share challenges, but face different fragilities. And why this context matters is that AI is going to shape the futures of these groups of economies, whether or not they're ready. And the key issues that need to be addressed include digital fragility and various aspects of that, poor connectivity, weak data systems, low AI skills, governance gaps, and higher risk of harm in terms of misuse of AI, exclusion, and external dependency. So as we move forward now to look more carefully at the digital fragility, I hand over to my colleague, Kelly Forbes. Kelly?
Thanks, Peter, and pleasure to be with everyone here today. So yes, building on, I think, what Peter has been sharing, our research really across ASEAN and the Pacific Islands have really showed that AI vulnerability in fragile and small states is structural, not necessarily technological. So first, we have foundation constraints, unreliable connectivity, weak data systems, limited cloud infrastructure, and really without digital public infrastructure, AI adoption, we know, cannot scale sustainably. Second, we really have human capital constraints, so limited AI literacy, low digital skills, and institutional capacity. This makes it very difficult to evaluate, procure, and really govern AI systems responsibly. Third, I think to highlight, I think we have a lot of governance gaps. So many of Pacific Islands, for example, they lack formal AI strategies. At a minimum level, we expect that economy or country would have an AI strategy well defined. A step further from that is to have an economy that is thinking about how do we develop an infrastructure guidelines around how to govern and set the policy foundations to be able to really manage risks accordingly. So the sequence here matters. Without digital resilience, digital resilience must really precede AI acceleration in many ways. And when we think about across these states, AI adoption really remains at a very early stage. So most activity is really project-based, donor-funded, and externally operated. Without that domestic capacity, AI really remains imported rather than embedded into the public systems in the way that we really need to see to be able to foster that adoption at scale. Some early cases, use cases that we see, we know AI is already present, I think particularly in humanitarian logistics, disaster response, public health. The strongest use case really are those tied to climate resilience and service delivery, particularly if you look across Pacific Islands, where we know climate change is really an urgent issue for them. And AI here can really serve as that potential in solving and supporting the acceleration that we really need to see. This is tied with when we think about the sustainable goals and how these economies are tracking, they're extremely vulnerable. And this is where AI can really offer hope. So we know AI can strengthen resilience, but only really if we can think about how do we go about embedding that into core public systems. So in terms of opportunities here, so we know, in many ways, the objective here is not necessarily scale, but it's thinking about how do we think about AI adoption in their own context, matching their own realities and with the structure that they currently have. Small and well-designed AI systems that can augment human capacity, particularly in those key sectors such as health, agriculture, and climate. What ASEAN has started to really show here is that regional governance framework. So the way that you think about how different economies can really work together to leapfrog, enable leapfrogging, rather than thinking about their own specific country context. So for these fragile states, you really can think about how to increase that cooperation on these core issues to really think about how AI should then support reducing that fragility. AI risks that scale, we know that particularly in fragile contexts, these AI risks can scale faster than regulatory or policy capacity can respond. Weak oversight really increases the probability of surveillance misuse, bias allocation of services, and misinformation and amplification. We know misinformation, for example, has been said to be one of the core issues in the last year or two, and it's directly related. And when we look at economies, countries, how they are performing in terms of AI literacy. The less there is investments in terms of how people can learn and adopt and understand how AI works, the more misinformation thrives in those environments. So for small states, really the policy errors are much amplified. And in this case, we need to think about that responsible AI is not necessarily a luxury. It's a precondition for stability in many ways here. So to really think about how do we go about developing a pathway for resilience here, we really need to think about the shift that is required from AI readiness to really develop that resilience. That means sequencing investments. How do we think about digital infrastructure first, institutional capacity, and then AI systems third? So that really only comes when that layer of foundation is already on the ground, right? So that means embedding governance safeguards at the outset, not after we see harms occurring, positioning to integrate infrastructure and finance, policy advisory, and regional coordination here. So if fragility really amplifies risks, then we think about how then resilience can amplify that capacity that we need to see in this case. Passing back to you, Peter.
Thank you, Kelly. So I think Kelly lays out the ideas on a pathway, and a key element of that pathway is going to be the benefits of regional cooperation in offsetting the limited capacity of individual countries. And we have done a lot of work in Pacific and in ASEAN on regional solutions, the benefits of shared governance, pooling expertise, developing regional infrastructure, data and compute platforms, and South-South learning. And I think in these areas, there's a tremendous opportunity in Pacific Islands, for example, the Pacific Islands Forum, with some financing. We recommended something called the AI Technical Assistance Facility for the Pacific Islands to pool resources, to possibly lead with a country like Fiji, which is implementing more AI activities than others, perhaps, but essentially co-designing activities with local resources, having clear ideas on high-risk AI activities and how to handle them, strengthening donor coordination, and looking at public interest. In the Pacific Islands, for example, the need to take into account local cultures and language issues, very critical. This factor became very evident in our research. I mean, and even within ASEAN, the fragile countries in ASEAN, certainly Myanmar, maybe Timor-Leste and others, can be part of that development process at the regional level. Overall, AI support as Kelly highlighted, must be patient, political, and also sensitive to the context. What we would see as key elements of strategy towards shifts from pilots to more integrated activities, we would see investment in institutions and not just tools, not just AI tools, but building the capacity for long-term governance and oversight, aligning agendas between the complex agendas of FCAS and SID states, integrating humanitarian development and digital strategies, and supporting long-term capacity development as we move ahead to implement the policies and strategies. So overall, key takeaways. There are quite a lot of similarities between FCAS and SIDS countries. And the key issue is not really whether AI will shape fragile states, but whether it will do so inclusively and responsibly. So we see some early stage activities and accelerating, gaining momentum, but requiring the establishment of key foundations that are going to be essential to develop a responsible AI capacity in these economies, where the risks and opportunities are real and taken care of, and where regional action becomes really critical. So we would see the importance is not really rapidly deploying AI, but developing the foundations, the capacity, the coordination to develop resilient readiness for AI. And projects to support that could include AI readiness measures, other regional in-depth analysis of the status of various sectors and so on. And we would see institutions, regional institutions, as being critical in developing that capacity. So I think that's our 20 minutes. Thank you very much, and we look forward to Q&A.
Thank you, Peter. So I will give a chance to my colleague in here to make a few comments from the side of Digital Sectors Office, and then we can start the Q&A session. In here, please.
Thank you. My name is In-hyuk Kwon from Digital Sector Office. First of all, regarding AI, I think the data safety is one of the critical and important aspect. So let me briefly explain actually how, for ADB project, how we try to mitigate potential digital risk of ADB project. ADB reduces potential digital risk using a digital risk assessment framework. Based on this framework, ADB assesses potential digital risk of project and provide practical solutions to mitigate them at national or project level. For example, key measures include designing a cyber risk owner to oversee data governance, conducting cybersecurity impact assessment for major technology change, developing an information security management system and cybersecurity plan based on assessment findings, and investing in security infrastructure through essential hardware, software, and specialized technical training. So this is a new initiative ADB tried to implement to mitigate potential digital risk of project. So I would like to share this new initiative so that actually ADB to share and all the participants that ADB has been trying to put efforts to mitigate potential digital risk for the data which will be used for AI in the future. Thank you.
So everyone, if you have any question for our speakers, please type them in the chat box so that we can see like who asks first, and then like we can answer those questions. I saw Destin, raise his hand. Can you type your question in the chat box? So we have a question, Peter and Kelly. It's in the chat, but I'll read it out. Public sector is known for lagging behind private sector and other actors in FCAS countries. Are there any examples of private sector using or abusing AI in those countries, perhaps without being governed at this stage? This includes militants, non-state armed actors, etc.
Yeah, great question, actually. Having said, I think this is why the governance or thinking about policy as part of that infrastructure that we need to see as we're bringing AI remains so important. At the same time, it's equally important that we have more private investment and collaboration with private public sector, particularly for this fragile state. So a good example of that is specifically what we're seeing in countries such as Thailand, where you have new collaborations with Google, for example, where they are not only upskilling people, giving them the opportunity to learn specifically in AI and related emerging technologies, but they also there on the ground enabling the creation of jobs, right? Which remains really important. So I think connecting those dots remains really important, and then it's I think places a greater responsibility in governments and the public sector, thinking about how do you govern those interactions, ensuring that the harms can be properly protected, right?
I'm on mute. So we have another question from David Vey from MYRM. The question is, while ADB cannot engage with the de facto government in Myanmar, does API know if ASEAN have started a discussion? Sorry, it moved. Discussion with the Myanmar de facto government on the policy opportunities identified in this presentation.
I'll let you take that one, Peter. You're on mute.
To tell you the truth, yeah, I'm not that up to speed on what's happening in Myanmar. Perhaps AKP will be more up to speed than we are. But clearly, the Myanmar government is involved in the governance activities of ASEAN in AI, including now extending to generative AI. How they are dealing with the policy opportunities, not easy to gather information on that right now.
Thanks, Peter. So we have another question. So thank you for the great presentation. In FCAS countries where institutional capacity and oversight mechanisms are often weakened, how can government design AI governance framework to prevent misuse, bias, and systemic harm while still enabling innovation and service delivery?
So I think the one advantage that we have for these countries is the fact that they can look up to what stronger economies are doing on that front, right? And when it comes to ASEAN, for example, we really saw with the work that we did how Singapore really shows lessons and in terms of how things are being managed, but also then how do you take that and adapt that to your own local context, right? So one of the opportunities is that there are now various, I think, examples of initiatives or programs that are in place that they can take inspiration from and then thinking about how they adapt that to their local context. Not sure if you have anything to add there, Peter.
I think the way that ASEAN has gone forward in this space, which is essentially led by Singapore as the regional leader on AI, but developing a governance framework and a policy guidance for member countries. I think is relatively sensible. The issue then is how well can each country, at very different levels of capacity and development within ASEAN, how do they adopt and build these guidelines into their domestic operations? And I think that's where you can see countries like Malaysia perhaps being able to do that in a more informed way, whereas countries like Cambodia or Laos or Timor-Leste are further behind. And I think there's a challenge there to implement those mechanisms. I think it's a great question, and clearly the issue of politics comes into play, the issue of local context come into play as you go forward. So yeah, I think and then underlying that, the need to keep the innovation framework solid and not hindered. So there's some clear implementation challenges, and we think an institution, a regional institution like ADB, could perhaps put in place a funding mechanism to provide the various levels of support to the various member countries with embedded technical assistance, with support in terms of what's happening globally, how that affects the countries and so on. And I think that initiative could focus a lot on safety, a lot on preventing misuse and harm and so on going forward.
Peter, so we have like 5 questions, but I don't think we have enough time to answer all those questions because we have a hard stop at 2 p.m. Manila time. So we have 5 questions. So Kelly, Peter, you can see those questions and maybe you can pick one uh, to answer before we wrap up. And you can also read the question, that you are going to answer.
So I think one of the interesting questions here from Christina, are there any examples to learn from on how to get countries to trust one another in developing regional approaches on AI applications for public sector functions? So I think it's important to highlight the message that for these particular countries, I mean, particularly when we look at the geopolitical state of the world currently, it remains very difficult for them. How are they going to be? We know when it comes to AI, you have two really leading economies that are leading in terms of the development and adoption and spreading some of these technologies across the world right now. So they remain very fragile. I think, frankly speaking, their biggest strength remains to how they can come together as a region to work really collaborative on these core issues. And without that, it will remain very, very difficult for them to really leapfrog on their own, right? So I think we have seen an extreme, great progress coming from ASEAN countries in the past year or so, because the geopolitical situation has really pushed them to think about how they can come together across these issues as a region. So that remains really important for a region like the Pacific Islands.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Kelly. And thank you, everybody, for joining and also for your very active discussion and active engagement. So I hope this session is very useful for you. And, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.